Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Jedi Way. I am John Rocha, also known as the Rocha Fett, one of your co-hosts for the show. Joined as always by the awesome Laura Kelly over there in Chicago. How are you, Laura?
I'm fabulous. I just got back from another massage, so it's going to be a fun conversation. It's going to be great.
We're gonna need you to have a glass of wine and the massage. Then we got ourselves the perfect Laura Kelly, I think.
Then you got a party. Hell yeah.
Well, we're recording this on the precipice of the final episode of The Mandalorian for season 2. A lot of excitement, a lot of people waiting for it, wondering who's going to show up if a Jedi shows up. So many connections in this Mandalorian season to things we've seen in the past. And speaking of the past, just a few days ago, there was the Disney Investor Day, and we did a breakdown of it on Sunday on the Geek Buddies, and I'm sure you've talked about it with a number of people, or all the incredible Star Wars announcements. And one of the big announcements was that Hayden Christensen is officially coming back to play Darth Vader in Kenobi, specifically Darth Vader. So we thought today on the show we'd take a journey through the or talk about the journey of Anakin Skywalker and what we might expect to see from Hayden Christensen as Darth Vader in Kenobi. Laura, what were your reactions to this initially? And then what's your thought about the fact that Kathleen Kennedy only said Darth Vader?
I have a lot of thoughts on this. So first of all, I was not at all surprised to hear that he was going to be joining the show. We've heard this, I think it was the Latino review media broke this story, this rumor, like months ago, that Hayden Christensen was in talks to return in the Obi-Wan Kenobi show, which we now know is just simply called Obi-Wan Kenobi. Simple. I like it. Tasteful. But the announcement itself was really unusual to me. That the way that they worded it was not that Hayden would be returning as Anakin, but that he would be returning as Darth Vader. My impression when we heard these rumors that Hayden would be coming back was that we were going to be seeing maybe like live action versions of scenes from the Clone Wars. Like we'd be seeing some flashback action. The fact that they're talking about him as Darth Vader makes me think that, he's going to be in the suit. He's going to have the mask on. I'm like, you could put anybody in there. Like, why did you bring Hayden all the way back for that? So I'm kind of hoping maybe that we still get some of those flashback scenes, because if you're going to have Hayden's face, you got to use it at some point. It's like Pedro Pascal. Yeah. You can't you don't want to discount the moneymaker. So I wasn't surprised. I am very excited. I am nowhere near as excited as what seems like most of the people in my Twitter timeline. I feel like I had a lot of people just like exploding with excitement at the announcement that Hayden was going to be coming back. So I'm really excited for them. I know what it's like to be that excited about something for Star Wars. So really happy that they're happy. This is all those like prequel kids that were head over heels for Hayden back in 2002 and 2005 that are so pumped, and I am pumped for them.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on this?
First of all, well, I mean, like whatever you want to say about the prequels, and I say this over and over again. I was never the biggest fan of them, as I said on the show. I think a few months ago, I tried to rewatch Phantom Menace and got 20 minutes in. I was like, I can't handle this. It's so bad. So it just some of the stuff there that's just difficult to walk through because of some of the latent racism or some of the subtle racism going on. Maybe not so subtle. It's difficult to watch. But that being said, I think Hayden Christensen, you could argue, was done a little bit dirty by some of the writing and some of the direction in the films themselves. And he's an actor that I've enjoyed in different projects. Shattered Glass is a fantastic film about a real life story about a journalist who forged this article and how he eventually got caught and what it led to, with a lot of great actors in that film. And he plays a smarmy guy trying to sneak his way out of it the whole film. And he does a fantastic job. There are a couple of the films that he's been in that I've enjoyed as well. So for me, I always felt that, he had to come back at some point to finish the circle. And over the last few years, as I've been, when I first started out doing this business, it was on a Star Wars show. It was far, far away over there on Geek Nation with Tiffany Smith and Christian. And so I was slowly getting back into Star Wars. And as this has progressed, I've been schooled on numerous occasions about how important the prequel trilogy is to so many fans. So it just seemed logical to me, as those fans got older and became a more how could I say this? A louder voice, became more vociferous about their defense of the prequels, it only made sense to find a way to bring back Hayden Christensen as a way of closing the circle. Because obviously you can't bring back Natalie because Padme passes away. But this closing of the circle here, they did it with Ahmed Best to a degree. I bet they'd love to do it with Jake Long at some point once he settles up what he needs to settle up in his own life. But this is another one that they really want to, especially because the Clone Wars really redeemed the story of Anakin Skywalker when you put it up against the prequel trilogy as a partnership. You really get a fuller picture of Anakin's journey through this. And by the way, they don't cut corners on the Clone Wars. There are a number of episodes where Anakin shows you the anger that he shows in the prequels, the places he's going to go, his ruthlessness at times with life, taking a life, which is ironic considering the whole time he only wants to protect life, the people he loves. He wants to be able to stop death from happening to the people he loves, yet he has no problem taking other people's lives throughout the Clone Wars and prequels. So I was excited to have Hayden Christensen come back, and then hopefully under better writing, better direction, really see him shine as this character, and then we can all put it to bed and move on with our lives. So that's the level of excitement I have on it.
That's really exciting. And yeah, I fully agree when it comes to the Clone Wars that there was a lot of redemption that happened with Anakin. Not the character, not so much like, his actual story arc or him as a character, but, the character just became a lot cooler. He was, so at least for me, I watched the Clone War, or I watched the prequel trilogy, a little bit later. I only saw Phantom Menace when I was about 11 years old, and then I didn't see the other ones until later. So I was, I think I was still a little bit jaded. I kind of knew the reputation of the prequels when I saw them, and sort of knew the reputation of Hayden's acting when I saw them. So I came into it with a sort of a different point of view, unfortunately. But I think this is going to be really exciting, especially, seeing what the Clone Wars is able to do for him. We're getting so much good content in Star Wars live action projects, especially those that are for streaming that are coming soon. I have no doubt that they're going to knock this out of the park. They're going to know how to use him. They're going to know how to, I don't know, kind of not go too far with it, probably pump the brakes a little bit, use it more subtly. But I'm excited to see him make appearances in the show. I think this is going to be fun.
Yeah, I think there'll be flashbacks, and I think there'll be masks being taken off in some way, shape, or form if they can have this kind of confrontation. Because why wouldn't Anakin say to him, "Look what you did to me. Look at me. Look at what you did. This is what you created." And Laura, you recommended that I read this story from a certain point of view, and that story is, I think it's called "There Is Another." It is just chock full of the guilt that Kenobi feels years later, now that he's been in Tatooine for 20 years, about the mistakes he made as a young man, being Anakin's master, for lack of a better term, in their training. So that kind of stuff paired with what you're seeing here, I think it gets me excited for what we might be seeing in terms of conversation or dialogue in these scenes that can get pretty intense or heated emotionally.
Yeah, when you brought up the topic of wanting to talk about Anakin, that was my first thought was, I need to make sure that he reads this story, because I'm sort of slowly working my way through from a certain point of view, the Empire Strikes Back edition. And this, I tweeted about this about a week ago, but this story really changed my perspective of Anakin. I've had that happen a few times in reading some of the canon novels that have come out, and this is one of those times where I had such a drastic mind shift with sort of how I interpreted Anakin overall, big picture as a character, and how he fell and why he fell the way that he did. So I'm glad that you went in and read this story. It was, it's one of the shorter ones in this book. There are some really, really long stories for what are supposed to be short stories in this book. This one was the perfect length for me, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if some of the content that we had in this story ultimately leads to a lot of what we're going to see in this Kenobi show. We don't know a ton else about what's going to be happening in the show. We have roughly an idea that it's going to be taking 10 years after Revenge of the Sith. We don't know much else. So this is sort of I feel like a sort of introduction maybe to what we could expect in the Kenobi show. I don't know.
That's fair. Absolutely. What is his level of guilt? What is his level of responsibility that he's negotiating or navigating for himself. You know, Laura, this is the thing that Dave Filoni said, and I know we'll get to that as well, but I want to take a little piece of what he said, that, yeah, it's all great to have the ships and the things that decorate Star Wars, but in these two trilogies, it is the story of the father and the son and the son and the father. And I think that's really important for me. These are my entry points into Star Wars. And I've said this to you 100 times and people have heard it from me before. It's not the ships or the planets, or it's the actual personal emotional stories that are going on. These are the things that hook me in, the philosophical concepts, the emotional journeys, the relationships, all of that. And so with Anakin, as I've gotten older, there's been more of a desire to enjoy the richness of this story. You could argue, well, I don't want to get in trouble, but you could argue that there is a real desire to flesh out and redeem more of the Anakin arc, more of the Anakin thing. He becomes almost the central figure of Star Wars completely, both Vader and Anakin, both forms of him, to make the whole thing work. And in essence, what he was, the chosen one, he just went one direction before he went back, or he was going one direction, then went to another, and before he finally went back and died. So it's just those things that I think are really important. Whereas Luke is pretty straight, Luke is pretty straight in what he does, and of course, what happens later in the sequel trilogy is what it is. But here with Anakin, there is so much richness to explore, especially in his beginnings. Right, we should start there. Laura, the son of Shmi Skywalker. They were slaves who were traded by the Hutts or enslaved by the Hutts, and then from there, Qui-Gon Jinn shows up because he senses this power in young Anakin. No, there is no dad, and there's a lot of rumors that it was the Sith Lord, that it was possibly Palpatine or a Sith Lord that possibly impregnated Shmi. Like, what's your feelings on this whole beginning and some of the cloudiness of the father side of things with Shmi and Anakin?
When it comes to Anakin's parentage on the dad side, I don't know. I think the thing with that comic that came out, that's
Yeah.
what really sort of spurred this conversation recently,
Yeah.
was that I think it was more of like a vision. So it was meant to be something that was like, oh, this is maybe how it could have gone, or this is like some character in this comic's interpretation of how it could have gone. I don't get the sense, having not read it personally, that was like, this is the definitive way of what happened. Because in that comic, they do make it seem like Palpatine is the father, in some sense. And I think maybe that might be putting too much stock into what was not meant to be completely interpreted that way. I could be wrong. Like I said, I haven't read it. But when it comes to, this concept of the chosen one, with Anakin, that was one of those great lines that we had in this Mackenzie Lee story. And from a certain point of view, was he was a chosen one without any choices. Right. And that really stuck with me, because, he didn't ask for Qui-Gon to come and take him off of Tatooine. Yeah. Like, he was a 9-year-old boy that dreamed of flying among the stars. Of course, he was going to jump at that chance, but and he had these special abilities, and then you've got these 2 Jedi Knights that walk into your life that want to take you and whisk you away so that you can, become the person that you've always dreamed of. There really wasn't going to be any contest there of whether or not he was going to leave. But because he had built up so much attachment to his mother by that point at the age of 9, he, that was really the downfall of all of it. But at the same time, it didn't have to be the downfall of all of it, because it was really just the way that the Jedi interpreted attachment. That's just I guess that's kind of how I like. The Jedi didn't have to go that route. They didn't have to be so detached from everything. That was a path that they chose to take collectively, and to sort of enforce among their students. And that's the big question, was that ever the correct way to go? Could Anakin's story have ended differently if they hadn't gone that route with the way that they sort of interpreted their role in the galaxy?
I think that's a fascinating point, Laura, for sure. I mean, this idea of, well, if they had honored his level of attachment to his mother instead of trying to use that against him, and we see when he's brought before the council remember, like you said, he's 9 years old. How many of us at 9 years old have fully fleshed out ideas about our emotional attachments to the people we're connected to? And although, yes, he's a great pod racer and, of course, ends up being a great pilot as well, it doesn't mean necessarily that he's got great emotional development. You know, he's an enslaved child. He's the son of a single mom. Like, what is naturally going to develop a very strong connection? And they seem to be judging him because he's not at their level when he walks before them at 9 years old. You know, I sense a strong attachment to your mom. He even says, what's that got to do with anything? Like, it's just pushing back at Yoda saying, you know, like, I don't get what you have a problem with this. It's my mother. How can you not think about it? And it's ironic because later on, I think when the Emperor sees Luke and Luke refuses to give in to the dark side, the Emperor cannot understand this attachment that Luke has to his father. So it's almost in reverse. If you juxtapose those both situations or look at both those situations, it's Yoda saying, Anakin, your connection to your mom gives us trouble, but yet it's Luke's connection to Anakin that ends up saving Anakin. So it's an interesting journey when you look at the path that is laid out for Anakin to walk and the decisions that are made for him before he's able to really understand the decisions he's making. I mean, you see this in divorce court where kids are brought in to choose between their parents. It's like, how can you possibly make a choice like that? The damage and the ramifications it can leave on you.
Yeah, thank goodness my parents waited until I was in my 20s to get divorced. But I think when it comes,
Sorry, Laura.
no, it's okay. The thing with Anakin though, and you know this attachment issue with his mother is that it didn't just end with her. You know, we saw that attachment almost immediately translate to Qui-Gon, who you know in this the Disney Gallery series we hear Dave Filoni sort of talk about Qui-Gon as the father figure. In the duel of the fates and how it's the duel of the fate of this boy. And then when we lose Qui-Gon in that battle, it sort of sets off this horrific chain of events that eventually leads to Anakin's downfall. But one of the things that this story, and from a certain point of view, talks about was how Yoda and Mace Windu, they did not make it easy for Anakin. They put these obstacles in front of him that they didn't make any other Padawan or any other youngling overcome, and just made his journey all the more harder when it just didn't need to be that way. But you know, that attachment carried over to Qui-Gon, and then it carried over to Obi-Wan, and we get these really touching moments in this story about how like Obi-Wan would wake up and find Anakin sleeping on the floor next to his bed, thinking that he would be gone because he's already had so many issues with attachment just up to the young age that he is. It was so heartbreaking, but at the same time, it was so enlightening for me about who Anakin was as a character. It was crazy how much it shifted my perspective.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, like you look at the attachment issues, right? You talk about, like you said, Shmi, then Qui-Gon, then Padme, then Obi-Wan, then Padme, and really Padme before Obi-Wan, to be honest.
Well, and Ahsoka too.
And then Ahsoka, right, which is handed to him by Yoda because Yoda is trying to get him to understand what it's like to have a connection like this, to get him to kind of like he maybe senses that he needs to have something like this to understand how to kind of calm some of his impulses, how to teach someone the better things to do in certain situations. And look, Ahsoka can be just as headstrong as Anakin, but she doesn't fall to the dark side. She doesn't go towards that that anger of Anakin's. And listen, they should have found a Jedi psychiatrist or a Jedi therapist to help Anakin, because like this, where there was a lot here that we needed to work out before he was handed ultimate power over the galaxy or what have you. And so there was a lot of that wasn't resolved. And so you can see why he ends up going the route he goes. It doesn't excuse it. It doesn't mean he's right to kill all those people to Alderaan and all the numerous people he killed if you read the comic books and what have you, and the other books. But it's more a matter of like, well, there was a lot of damage here done. And I mean, holding your mother after she's been God knows what by these Tusken Raiders and having her die in your arms because you were away and couldn't be there to save her with all your, I mean, it's like Peter Parker, right? So Uncle Ben dies with all his power. He could have saved Uncle Ben and he doesn't. So there is that same beat in a lot of these hero stories, because at the time he is a hero, is the loss of someone important to them, even with all their power, they couldn't save them. So it teaches them to have empathy. But with Anakin, it teaches him to have even more anger and a desperation not to lose the people he loves. And yet he does. He does. There's that story in the comics, in the comic books, where he gets that helmet, and the helmet transports him into this portal, and he sees an angry Padme, and then sees Anakin rather, and he knows both are dead now for real. So Padme, Qui-Gon, his mom, possibly his children, because she was pregnant in his mind, and then also the loss of Kenobi as a friend, and then eventually he kills him. So it's just like every single person that has come into his life that is any level of importance aside from the Emperor, and then the Emperor, he eventually kills himself. He either kills or is taken from him, and that's a hell of a weight to carry for a chosen one in this galaxy.
Yeah, it's hard. And you really can't talk about Anakin without sort of acknowledging Obi-Wan in his role in all of what led Anakin to the place that he was. I mean, I think the sort of question is, was Obi-Wan prepared to take on this young child that ended up having to have such a different path to becoming a Jedi Knight than what was traditional at the time, and what had been traditional for Obi-Wan himself? Anakin had such a different path laid before him than what Obi-Wan had experienced, and was Obi-Wan really ready to take this on? And I think that's part of the guilt that plagues him all the way up through this story that we get in Empire Strikes Back, and from a certain point of view. But yeah, you talk about all the bad deeds that we saw from Vader, and I guess in my mind, I had always compartmentalized Vader and Anakin to be very different people. I'm not really sure why I did that, but it just, he talks about how Vader even says it, I think, in Rebels. He's like, Anakin Skywalker is dead. And for me, it's always been a very clear divide until I read what the second Thrawn book in the new Thrawn trilogy. I think it was Thrawn Alliances. And we get a lot of Vader action, but then also flashbacks to when he was Anakin. And there's two adventures going on at the same time in this book, and we kind of jump back and forth between the chapters. But it wasn't until I read that book that I really sort of gave it some thought that Anakin is still in there. They're not as separate as I had compartmentalized them in my head. He's still in there, and he's like still fighting in a way to sort of break free from this prison that he's in this suit, and in the environment that he's in, being the Emperor's hand. So it was all of these stories that we're getting sort of post from the movies have been really interesting, in the comics as well, to sort of shed additional light on who Vader and who Anakin are as characters.
Yeah, in the top 10, we did a live show in Chicago a couple of years ago, and I got into some hot water with the fans, and it was a great reaction because I said that we were counting down our top 10 Star Wars villains at Celebration, and I put Anakin and Darth Vader on the list. Two different villains, yet the same person. Because to me, Anakin isn't Darth Vader till he puts on the suit and Padme dies. His last emotional connection to his past life is Padme, and when she dies, he puts on the suit and that terrible no. He's now officially Darth Vader, a completely different person. Anakin killed the younglings. Anakin tried to kill Kenobi. Anakin force choked out Padme till she passed out. Anakin killed Mace Windu, or helped to kill Mace Windu. Anakin cut Dooku's head off. Like, those are the Anakin stuff, right? But when he makes that change in the Vader, that's a completely different thing. But as you're talking about Thrawn Alliances, is interesting to note, and I think it's brilliant to put that in there because that just only reinforces Luke's belief that Anakin can be saved, that Anakin is in there, that his father is in there, and it needs that reconnection back to Padme, which Luke is, to finally pull that part of him out of him. And there's even that line, I think it's in Jedi or it's in Empire Strikes Back, when he says, "It's too late for me. Obi-Wan once felt as you did, but it's too late for me, son. It's too late for me, son." That is such a beautiful line. And for people who have been in that place, or people who know that place, or heard their fathers maybe say that place in their life, it is a resonant line that speaks volumes about Anakin and what you just said, that he is still in there. Because remember, even when he kills Windu or helps to kill Windu, he goes, "What have I done? what have I done? And then he gives himself to a father figure, which is the Emperor. You're replacing Qui-Gon. Here's a strong father figure. I'm going to follow him. But as he gets older, doesn't it make sense that he starts to question this whole thing, especially if you're reading the comics, that his dad is constantly making him test his loyalty to him? It's a very ugly and toxic codependent relationship.
Yeah, the Emperor is it's an interesting, wrench to throw into it with Anakin and what led to his downfall, because we do see in a couple of instances in the films of, Palpatine sort of like has his hand on his shoulder and he calls him son. Right. And it's like, God, man, this kid, he really just didn't have a chance. I mean, he was groomed from the very beginning to basically be under the Sith Lord's wing, even before he realized it. So it's it's one of those things I'm still slowly kind of coming to terms with, because you look at what happens just at the end of Revenge of the Sith when he's choking his pregnant wife, and she falls and passes. It's just like I had questioned, like, I don't know if you'd even be able to show that kind of violence against a pregnant woman in 2020 in a movie. I don't think you would be able to get away with that. I think you would probably have a much louder outraged reaction now than you would have in 2005. And it kind of weirds me out that there wasn't, at least I don't remember there being a bigger reaction to that in 2005. And just having seen that, it's hard to separate Anakin from Vader. He still has Anakin's face in that instance. So for me, it's been a really hard go of it, trying to like really reconcile. Did he really earn the redemption that he got in Return of the Jedi? I think that's a sort of sticking point for a lot of fans.
Well, I think, this is a film. This is a series that started in 1977. We're in the post years of Vietnam. Superman is 1 year away. There's this idea of redeeming, and then we're having our fathers coming back from Vietnam with PTSD, with issues with anger and all this kind of stuff. So Star Wars hits at that time perfectly, where people see the possibility of redemption in an angry father figure, the possibility of hope in an angry, in somehow bringing out the best, or bringing your father back to the good person he could have been, or the good person you've built up in your mind that you thought he was. And that's why I think at the time, people loved it, and people do still love it, right? But I think also what has happened over the years, Laura, and this is a great point you bring up, is a reassessment of it. Is like, okay, cool, Luke brought this out and he killed the Emperor, but there's still millions of people that died at this dude's hands and his bloodthirsty anger. Do we just kind of shove that under the table because eventually he was redeemed? It's a great question to ask, and I think it's a generational one. In terms of like how people look at it.
Yeah, and I haven't spent a ton of time with like Luke Skywalker's story following Return of the Jedi. I know we got in like in Shattered Empire. I know it was a comic series that was set right after it, and I read that a long time ago, so I don't really remember it. But I think it would be interesting to really explore and sort of dive deep into him, to Luke Skywalker, like just be in his head for a little bit and swim around and try and figure out what is he thinking, like in a retrospect of, the destruction of the Emperor and the redemption of his father. Like, how is he processing all of that after the fact? We get a great sort of resolution at the end of Return of the Jedi, and everyone's dancing on Endor, and it's a grand old time. But that's the thing with the comics and books. We get to dive a little deeper into the story, and that's something I'd be curious to see. And maybe it already exists. I think there's a book that came out a few years ago that was The Legends of Luke Skywalker that I didn't read. But that, I don't know, it could be worth maybe picking up now. Maybe I need to circle back to it.
Well, maybe. And there's, once again, there's the connection, the similar experience, right? Shmi dying in Anakin's arms, Anakin dying in Luke's arms. The connection there, and the difference where Luke at the end of Jedi looks to be at peace with everything and ready to go take on the galaxy. Anakin at the end becomes this angry thing that becomes Vader. So it's just the different reactions to it. And you might argue it's because Luke had, even though he may have hated his Aunt Owen and Beru, and the frustration of a life as a moisture farmer, he still had somewhat of a semblance of a parental unit to guide him through some of the tough times. Whereas Anakin was always losing parental units, and then eventually handed himself over to the wrong dad, absolutely, and had himself corrupted from the inside out. And as much of a badass as he was, and he was a badass in a way, he was also incredibly damaged spiritually and emotionally, and unable to make connections with people emotionally until Luke shows back up into his life.
Yeah. One of Anakin's other qualities is that he was very stubborn, and that's another quality that Obi-Wan talks about, and it's from a certain point of view story. Yeah. And he kind of talks about how he can see Anakin's stubbornness in Luke, and once he sets his mind to something, there's no changing it. There's nothing you can do to make any kind of difference once he's made up his mind about something.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting character trait. I do enjoy how they kind of make Anakin, sometimes he's a little bit of like the dark comedy relief in the Clone Wars.
Yeah.
And I really enjoy that use of him in that way. Even knowing sort of where it all ends up. But I mean, there's one arc in particular where I think it's, Obi-Wan and Satine are like sort of professing their love for each other, and there's someone holding them at gunpoint, and they're like, he asked them, which one of you is going to brand yourself a cold-blooded killer and take me out before I destroy everyone and everything on the ship. And then Anakin stabs him from behind through a door. And we get a little bit of that, like, dun, 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 like, and the score. And it's so perfect, but it's also really funny. Maybe that's just my messed up sense of humor, but they do find ways to sort of bring out these little, qualities in Anakin in this era, in particular in the Clone Wars. And I sort of think of it as like a product of its time. You talked about how Return of the Jedi was sort of a product of its time in terms of Vietnam. And I kind of think maybe in sort of where we were in comedy and where we were in, politics at that time, that was it was one solution, and I kind of like how they used it.
Yeah. Well, and you look, there's throughout the Clone Wars, as we mentioned earlier, like there are moments where Anakin, the dark humor is there, certainly, because he's like, what? He was going to blow up the ship. What? It's like a no big deal to him sometimes. And certainly him and Ahsoka have those occasional exchanges, which are really funny when he's mad at her being headstrong, which is the irony of ironies there. But there's also those moments like that scene where he's beating up that senator who is trying to kiss Padme. Like, that's a glimpse into that anger, and Padme stays with him, right? And that's the thing. Like, there is a lot of evidence when you watch the Clone Wars, or at least enough evidence of red flags that this is not a guy you should be with. Yet she sticks around and stays with him in the storyline arcs. But he's like a very big hothead, and even when he's like just punching him, eventually he stops. He's like, "Oh my God, I'm sorry," and you're just like, "Wait, what? You're sorry?" And you hear of people who have been with abusive boyfriends or abusive husbands, and they lose control like that. And it's almost immediately after they lose control that they're a ball crying on the ground in the fetal position, ashamed of what they've done, And so there is certainly that element of coursing through Anakin throughout his story.
Yeah, the Clovis stuff in the Clone Wars is really interesting. But you talk about like the abuser in the relationship curling up into a ball and crying afterwards, and that in itself is manipulative and abusive to their partner, and it's hard to watch. But the Clovis stuff was interesting. The way that they sort of evolved the darkness, especially in the later seasons, that was a great example of it. When the council fakes Obi-Wan's death, having to watch Anakin react to that was really hard and really sad. And you definitely, I mean, at that point, it's not even the shades of darkness. It's full blown. Yeah. Oh, this is one of the major events that led to Anakin falling. Right. I think we can establish that. And then Ahsoka leaving, and then it's just the cherry on top of the icing on the cake. Right. So it's, you get to see that evolution. It's one of the many reasons Clone Wars is such an amazing addition to the canon. Just mostly, I think, for me, like what it does for Anakin, and then what the story group has given us even since then in the form of books and comics to evolve it further. It's all been a really interesting ride. I wonder how many other people are sort of having, if you're out there, if you're reading these books, how many other people are having these sort of ups and downs with Anakin. For me, it's a never ending cycle.
I think he's more fascinating than Luke because we all, and I'll probably get in trouble for that. And people get crazy. I mean, fine. But I think he's more fascinating than Luke. And the reason is because he's troubled. He's so troubled. Yet there are instances or situations from his past where you can find the sympathy for him, or you can try to rationalize at least a little bit some of his reactions to things based on what your experience is like in your life. You know, what you've experienced, what you've gone through, what you've encountered, what you've seen your friends possibly go through. You can connect. There's so much about him that depending on what story you read or what slice of his life you're catching him in, that you can either be totally freaked out by this guy and unsettled by his aggressiveness, or at the same token, really respect his protective desire to save the people he loves because of the damage of enduring so many losses. And yeah, the death of the fake death of Obi-Wan is fantastic to bring up, Laura, because it's like, didn't you guys like take a look at this dude and his background here and think that maybe this wasn't the smartest decision to make at this point? Like, did he strike you as the really most emotionally stable person to be playing this game with? I think there's a lot of fault here for Yoda and the Jedi. And certainly Yoda starts to sense it in Attack of the Clones that maybe they've got this thing wrong, and they've kind of messed this thing up in the galaxy. So Anakin is a terrible person, absolutely, or the things he does, but there is reasons to look at here. You're not excusing things, but you can look at patterns here where the Jedi really dropped the ball on someone like this and probably didn't understand how to guide and navigate a chosen one.
No, they really had no idea. And I think when, this poor, so much of what happens and what goes wrong is the fault of the Jedi Order. And it's so frustrating to watch them fail and fail and fail time and time again, and just continually make the wrong decisions because they've become so politicized in the prequel trilogy. Even in Phantom Menace, by the time we meet them all in Phantom Menace, like 32 years before the fall of the Republic, they're still there. You can already see the downfall coming. It's hard. And there are these legendary peacekeepers, and I think that maybe is going to be one of the interesting things about the High Republic when we start diving into that. I would love to figure out how in the world did they get to the point that they got to in Phantom Menace? Where were we 200 years ago? Was it better? Like, it couldn't have been worse. So it had to have been better. But yeah, they definitely, by the time we meet them, even in Phantom Menace and certainly in Revenge of the Sith, they have most definitely lost their way.
Yeah, and that's the thing that's unsettling, because and I think is a little gutsy of Lucas to put that in the in that trilogy, because out of the original trilogy, we love the Jedi. The Jedi are great. The Jedi teach. The Jedi have the right way to go. The Jedi way. But like, you look at this prequel trilogy and you're like, man, this is tough to watch, because this idea of the politicization of them is frustrating to watch. And you go, well, then nothing is infallible. Nothing can be flawless. It is corruptible in some way. And when you look at the history of how many Jedi have turned to the dark side and some have turned back, it's really something that you have to kind of factor that in, that yes, the Jedi stand for some good things. And certainly what it says, and I think what it says in the book is what in the story, like, if the Skywalkers didn't feel everything so much, didn't want to save everybody so much, didn't care so much. And this idea that really struck me as I was watching some scenes in preparation for the show from the Clone Wars and from the movies, it's like, that's the problem. The Jedi have so removed attachment that to them, they don't understand why it is important to help, why it's important. I mean, Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan do not free Shmi and Anakin from the situation, just Anakin, and he still has to win his freedom. It isn't given to him. So it's just that kind of thing. Well, I thought you all were the good people. You're to stop this stuff from happening in the universe. It's like, no, we don't have those kinds of, it's not really our duty. And so we don't have those kinds of attachments. it's like, well, attachments, I think, in balance with doing the right thing are important in the world, and that's what the Jedi discover as they go along in that prequel trilogy.
Yeah, and even Shmi says the Republic doesn't exist out here. We see that on Tatooine, that slavery is still widespread despite
Right.
having been outlawed. And, that was one of the things in the story, how we're going to give justice to Anakin in a way. We're going to take him out of this situation and free him as a slave. But besides that, there's no justice on Tatooine. It's all up to the Hutts and, however they want to rule, and however cruelly they want to do it. But I think that's one of those interesting things is that, they don't go back to Tatooine after they've taken Anakin, or maybe they do. Maybe there's a comic or something in that 10 years between Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, but we don't see them go back to Tatooine and free all the slaves and be like, hey, these Hutts are getting a little bit out of control. Slavery is still running rampant out here. They just kind of go back to Coruscant and go about their business and sort of just sweep it under the rug. So even in that, the detachment that exists just in that one thing, because since we see Anakin go back 10 years later, he can see that there are still slaves everywhere.
Yeah.
It's just, it's one of those unfortunate things that they had a chance to go in and try and make a difference in more than just this one boy's life. And they didn't take the chance to do that. They didn't send anyone to take the chance to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, and this is what is always so fascinating about Anakin is the tragedy of Anakin. I mean, we hear, so much about his story when you're looking through it, reading through it, watching it. There are just these moments, these flag post moments, where you're just like, if only, there are throughout. Because I think Kenobi, and he says it in the book, and I've always felt this way as I've gotten older and reassessed the prequel trilogy, is that Kenobi never wanted to train Anakin. It wasn't, he didn't, remember, he tries to tell Qui-Gon to get rid of Anakin, that he's just like a Jar Jar. He's not really, he's a useless creature in essence. And so then eventually, only because Qui-Gon dies in his arms and makes him make that promise, does he train him. And so when you watch Alec Guinness as Kenobi in A New Hope, getting a call there, say, he was a good friend. There was this there's real, and then when you go back and watch in the prequel trilogy, you're like, doesn't sense like there was a strong friendship here. And it isn't until the Clone Wars that you get a little bit more of the fleshed out friendship. But even then, Anakin is always kind of going off, doing his own thing, violating the rules, being hot-headed, being aggressive, ignoring Kenobi at times. But when you read this, and it's so funny, Laura, you bring up that story, the 6 pages or 10-page story that it is, you get more of a fleshed out idea of what Kenobi sees now in retrospect as the mistakes he made at that time, because he was caught up in his own shit and didn't have time to, because he wasn't that stable himself to be training someone like Anakin. He was not a master in any way, shape, or form yet. He was still learning as a Padawan from Qui-Gon when Qui-Gon died. So it also was a lot to put on Kenobi, and certainly there's a guilt there to feel that he didn't guide Anakin in the right way himself, which is why he takes more care with Luke in a way, I think, and Yoda too, both of them in a way kind of making up for the mistakes they made with Anakin, his father.
Exactly. They do seem to be a little bit more subtle with Luke. They're not pushing quite as hard. They're sort of letting him, choose his own path instead of doing what they did with Anakin, which was basically trying to force him into a mold that he was never meant to fit in.
Right.
And that was another one of those great lines from the story, was that you can only reform someone so many times before they start to break. Yeah. And that was this failed attempt with Anakin that ultimately led to where we ended up in this galaxy far, far away.
I do want to read. I was hoping to find the line near the end. Where was it? Near the end, he says, "Oh yeah, here it is." It says, "What kind of choice had that been for him, Qui-Gon? Leave your mother for a prophecy that you've never heard of, to join an order of legendary peacekeepers who arrive on your planet only to tell you that they aren't free. They aren't there to free you from the barbaric system you're a part of. That's the legendary justice of the Jedi, is for others. There is no justice on Tatooine. He was the chosen one without any choices of his own. And that's what you brought up, Laura, earlier. That paragraph and that ending just kind of hit me like a diamond bullet when I read it. It was like, yeah, there was so much, as you said earlier, that was out of Anakin's control, which is what makes him such a fascinating character. As much as we may look at him and be like, well, he killed all these people. Absolutely. Was he ruthless? Absolutely. Is there a reappreciation to the point where people now kind of idolize Darth Vader? Sure. But,
thanks, Rogue One.
yeah, that's a good point. But like you get all this idea too that this path was never chosen for him. I mean, he didn't choose this path. The path was chosen for him, and he tried to navigate it as best he could with his limited emotional vocabulary and his predisposition to anger or vengeance. Because obviously, this is, as an enslaved person, it's very difficult to develop the right instincts to deal with a situation in your life, you know? So I find that to be such an interesting thing about him.
Exactly. Yeah. This story that we've talked about a lot in this episode, from a certain point of view, The Empire Strikes Back. The story is called There Is Always Another. It was written by Mackenzie Lee.
Yeah.
It is 100% worth it to get this book just for that one story. It's so good. If you're an Audible or audiobook person, it's 100% worth an audiobook credit. That's how I've been probably getting through most of it. The story in particular is just so good. There's a handful of others I really like, but this one has really stuck with me, I think.
Thank you for
So definitely. Yeah, you're welcome. Did you have any other favorites in that book, by the way? Have you gotten through any of it?
Not yet. We'll be talking. I think we should set aside a separate episode to do that, to talk about that and break down which stories we liked coming up here in the next couple of weeks. Maybe for the New Year's Eve one, as we were talking about going live with that one, or maybe just doing it as a pre-record for the holiday. That might be a possibility for us. Could be a lot of fun. But as we wrap up here, Laura, because we're at the 45-minute mark, real quick, what do you think we're going to see in the Obi-Wan Kenobi series? Do you see? I mean, I think Kathleen Kennedy said the ultimate rematch. And so this sounds like we're going to get another battle between Kenobi and Darth Vader, coming right after the Mustafar fight. This would be their second fight. In a rematch, do you expect we'll see something like that?
I do. And, there's this one line in A New Hope that has always sort of stuck with me in this weird way, which is when they're on the Death Star and Vader says to Obi-Wan, "You shouldn't have come back." Yeah. And that has always just made me think, like, there was another instance at some point in this, 19-year gap. They did meet again at some point. And I think that's maybe what we're going to see play out. My hope for Obi-Wan, I don't know if I think it's going to happen, but my hope is that we are not just stuck on Tatooine for the entire show. I mean, like, I kind of understand how that's supposed to be the purpose, that, Obi-Wan was there to be a guardian for Luke. Luke also had two parents to raise him. So, I mean, I don't feel like Obi-Wan had to be around all the time. And I like to think that he would have taken off and gone to another planet or gone on some other adventure at some point in that 20-year time period. So that's my hope, is that at some point, at least, besides even just like dreams, flashbacks, visions, what have you, we will take a departure from Tatooine at some point.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on Obi-Wan? Do you have any predictions? Any thoughts on it?
I think certainly the battle. I think you're right. I think it probably won't be on Tatooine. I think there would be too much. I mean, didn't we see Darth Maul and Kenobi on Tatooine in that legendary fight in Clone Wars? And we've seen enough already on Tatooine already for the Mandalorian. So to keep coming back to it, I think would be a bit much. So on some other planet, because remember the fight was on Mustafar. So let's have another fight on another planet between these two in some way, shape, or form. I would be excited to see that. And there's another line, I think it's in New Hope, where Vader says, "I sense a presence I haven't felt since," and he never ends. He never ends the line. So it's like, since when? And so we're, in our eyes, or our minds, of course, we've always thought, well, since the fight on Mustafar, but that is so open-ended. There's a number of places you can go with that and set that. So I look forward to that. And I look forward to, hopefully, now in 2020, 2021, whenever this thing's coming out, 2022 maybe, that with our perspective, as Laura brought up a few times on the show today, our perspective of looking back at this relationship, looking back at what was shown to us in previous installments in Star Wars here about this relationship, that there may be more emotionally advanced conversations between these two who are older in age now and closer in emotional maturity, and can have like a really honest back and forth in between the lightsabers slamming into each other for sure. But that, I think that would be exciting to see for me personally as a kind of developing part of this relationship and another installment to put into this story.
Yeah, I think my prediction is that it's going to be a little bit more of like less is more with the use of Hayden and Vader in this show. I sort of wonder if it's I don't foresee him being like a lead or a supporting role. I see it more as featured. So I like the idea of Obi-Wan having these conversations out loud with somebody else. We sort of spend a lot of time in Obi-Wan's head in this in some of these from a certain point of view stories where he's talking to Qui-Gon and talking to Yoda and talking to Luke. But it would be nice to see him actually have some of these conversations and ruminate on some of these thoughts out loud with other people. So that it's not all just monologue and voiceover of Ewan in this show.
Or a Qui-Gon Force Ghost. I'm sure he'll be there to have conversations with. Do you anticipate?
Absolutely.
Do you anticipate Ahsoka Tano?
Oh, that's a good question. I kind of think not, and only because I think we get a line in Rebels from her assuming that Obi-Wan is dead, or maybe it's not Ahsoka. Maybe it's somebody else in Rebels talks about how if they, she hadn't seen him in a while. I don't remember what it was. But I have a feeling no. They're going to stick with her on her own show. I do wonder if we'll get Bail Organa.
Yes, Bail is a possibility I've thought about as well. Will it be a de-aged Jimmy Smits, or will they cast a new Latino actor to play that? I look forward to it. I want to see that as well. All right, let's wrap up there. This has been the latest episode of the Jedi Way. We kind of talked about Anakin and his journey. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Laura, where can they, and Laura, thanks again. This was a blast. Where can they find you and everything you got going on?
Yeah, thanks, John. This is a great idea. I was excited to bring this up and talk about this. You can find me on Twitter. My handle is shutup_Laura. There's lots of fun Star Wars goodness happening there all the time. And my other show is Force Toast Star Wars Happy Hour. My co-host Alice and I just released our 50th episode. So we're very excited about that. It's an every other week show. We've been doing it about 2 years now. But it was a very fun episode, so worth checking out if you have the time. And yeah, that is at Force Toast Pod on Twitter if you want to find that show.
And there's a special guest I heard on this 50th episode.
There's a little cameo. Yeah.
Look at that face.
Surprise.
Look at her. She became 10 years old again. Look at her face.
I love it.
So
getting giddy all over again.
That's awesome. Well, you can always find me at the Rocha Says on Twitter and on Instagram, and let me know your thoughts, or tweet Laura and I your thoughts about this, about what we talked about with Anakin. What are some of the other points of views, other perspectives you all might have that we didn't quite cover or get into? Feel free, let us know. Always open to hear new ideas and new points of views on all of this. It's an ever evolving thing, Star Wars, which is why it's always so much fun. Or let us know in the comments section below. Remember to subscribe to the Outlaw Nation channel as well for more of the Jedi Way stuff that we do here and all the other content we do here on the channel, and like this episode as well and share it on your social media. The more likes, the more comments, the more shares you do, it allows more and more people to come aboard the Jedi Way train. And don't forget that we have the Geek Buddies breakdown of The Mandalorian coming up as well on Friday, the final episode of season 2 dropping just in like a little over 24 hours as we're recording this. So get ready for that. And we're going to break it all down. We're still figuring out if we can do it live. We can get all 4 of us there live. That's our plan. So look out for that very, very soon on the Outlaw Nation channel as well. All right, Laura, what do we got to tell them?
What we got to tell them is until next time, remember, dear fans, that your focus determines your reality.